millions of things, we wouldn't be much so puzzled with 'em as we are." The truth of this last remark was so self-evident and incontrovertible that it elicited no reply, and the three friends rode on for a considerable time in silence. It was now past noon, and they were thinking of calling a halt for a short rest to the horses and a pipe to themselves, when Joe was heard to give vent to one of those peculiar hisses that always accompanied either a surprise or a caution. In the present case it indicated both. "What now, Joe?" "Injuns!" ejaculated Joe. "Eh? Fat do you say? Where's they?" Crusoe at this moment uttered a low growl. Ever since the day he had been partially roasted he had maintained a rooted antipathy to red men. Joe immediately dismounted, and placing his ear to the ground, listened intently. It is a curious fact that by placing the ear close to the ground, sounds can be heard distinctly which could not be heard at all if the listener were to maintain an erect position. "They're arter the buffalo," said Joe, rising, "and I think it's likely they're a band of ponies. Listen, and you'll hear their shouts quite plain." Dick and Henry immediately lay down and placed their ears to the ground. "Now me hear nothing," said Henry, jumping up, "but me ear is like me eyes, very short-sighted." "I do hear something," said Dick as he got up, "but the beating of my own heart makes it row enough to spoil my hearing." Joe Blunt smiled. "Ah, lad, you're young, and your blood's too hot yet. But I'll bide you a bit. You'll cool down soon. I was like you once. Now, lads, what do you think we should do?" "You know best, Joe." "Oui, no doubtedly." "Then what I advise is that we gallop to the broken sand hillocks you see yonder, get behind 'em, and take a peep at the redskins. If they are ponies, we'll go up to them at once. If not, we'll hold a council of war on the spot." Having arranged this, they mounted and hastened toward the hillocks in question, which they reached after 10 minutes' gallop at full stretch. The sandy mounds afforded them concealment, and enabled them to watch the proceedings of the savages in the plain below. The scene was the most curious and exciting that can be conceived. The centre of the plain before them was crowded with hundreds of buffaloes, which were dashing about in the most frantic state of alarm. To whatever point they galloped, they were met by yelling savages on horseback, who could not have been fewer in numbers than 1,000, all being armed with lance, bow, and quiver, and mounted on active little horses. The Indians had completely surrounded the herd of buffaloes, and were now advancing steadily towards them, gradually narrowing the circle, and, whenever the terrified animals endeavoured to break through the line, they rushed to that particular spot in a body, and scared them back again into the centre. Thus they advanced until they closed in on their prey, and formed an unbroken circle round them, whilst the poor brutes kept eddying and surging to and fro in a confused mass, hooking and climbing upon each other, and bellowing furiously. Suddenly the horsemen made a rush, and the work of destruction began. The tremendous turmoil raised a cloud of dust that obscured the field in some places, and hid it from our hunters' view. Some of the Indians galloped round and round the circle, sending their arrows whizzing up to the feathers in the sides of the fattest cows. Others dashed fearlessly into the midst of the black heaving mass, and, with their long lances, pierced dozens of them to the heart. In many instances the buffaloes, infuriated by the wounds, turned fiercely on their assailants and gored the horses to death, in which cases the men had to trust their nimble legs for safety. Sometimes a horse got jammed in the centre of the swaying mass, and could neither advance nor retreat. Then the savage rider leaped upon the buffaloes' backs, and springing from one to another like an acrobat, gained the outer edge of the circle, not failing, however, in his strange flight, to pierce with his lance several of the fattest of his stepping stones as he sped along. A few of the herd succeeded in escaping from the blood and dust of this desperate battle, and made off over the plains, but they were quickly overtaken, and the lance or arrow that brought them down on the green turf. Many of the dismounted riders were chased by bulls,
but they stepped lightly to one side, and, as the animals passed, drove their arrows deep into their sides. Thus the tumultuous war went on, amid thundering tread, and yell, and bellow, till the green plain was transformed into a sea of blood and mire, and every buffalo of the herd was laid low. It is not to be supposed that such reckless warfare is invariably waged without damage to the savages. Many were the wounds and bruises received that day, and not a few bones were broken, but happily no lives were lost.
"Now, lads, now's our time. A bold and fearless look's the best at all times. Don't look as if you doubted their friendship. And mind, whatever you do, don't use your arms. Follow me."
Saying this, Joe Blunt leaped on his horse, and bounding over the ridge at full speed, galloped headlong across the plain. The savages observed the strangers instantly, and a loud yell announced the fact, as they assembled from all parts of the field, brandishing their bows and spears. Joe's quick eye soon distinguished their chief, towards whom he galloped, still at full speed, till within a yard or two of his horse's head. Then he reined up suddenly. So rapidly did Joe and his comrades approach, and so instantaneously did they pull up, that their steeds were thrown almost on their haunches. The Indian chief did not move a muscle. He was a tall, powerful savage, almost naked, and mounted on a coal-black charger, which he sat with the ease of a man accustomed to ride from infancy. He was indeed a splendid-looking savage, but his face wore a dark frown, for although he and his band had visited the settlements and trafficked with the fur traders on the Missouri, he did not love the "pale faces," whom he regarded as intruders on the hunting grounds of his fathers, and the peace that existed between them at that time was of a very fragile character. Indeed, it was deemed by the traders impossible to travel through Indian country at that period except in strong force, and it was the very boldness of the present attempt that secured to our hunters anything like a civil reception. Joe, who could speak the Pawnee tongue fluently, began by explaining the object of his visit, and spoke of the presents which he had brought for the great chief. But it was evident that his words made little impression. As he discoursed to them, the savages crowded round the little party, and began to handle and examine their dresses and weapons with a degree of rudeness that caused Joe considerable anxiety. "Matois believes the heart of the palefaces is true," said the savage, when Joe paused, "but he does not choose to make peace. The palefaces are grasping. They never rest. They turn their eyes to the great mountains and say, 'There we will stop,' but even there they will not stop. They are never satisfied. Matois knows them well." This speech sank like a death knell on the hearts of the hunters, for they knew that if the savages refused to make peace, they would scalp them all and appropriate their goods. To make things worse, a dark-visaged Indian suddenly caught hold of Henry's rifle, and, ere he was aware, plucked it from his hand. The blood rushed to the gigantic hunter's forehead, and he was on the point of springing at the man, when Joe said in a deep, quiet voice, "Be still, Henry. You will but hasten death." At this moment there was a movement on the outskirts of the circle of horsemen, and another chief rode into the midst of them. He was evidently higher in rank than Matois, for he spoke authoritatively to the crowd, and stepped in before him. The hunters drew little comfort from the appearance of his face, however, for it scowled upon them. He was not so powerful a man as Matois, but he was more gracefully formed, and had a more noble and commanding countenance. "Have the pale faces no wigwams on the great river that they should come to spy out the lands of the Pawnee?" he demanded. "We have not come to spy your country," answered Joe, raising himself proudly as he spoke, taking off his cap. "We have come with a message from the great chief of the pale faces, who lives in the village far beyond the great river where the sun rises. He says, 'Why should the pale face and the red man fight? They are brothers. The same Manitou,' the Indian name for God, watches over both. The pale faces have more beards and guns and blankets and knives and vermilion than they require.
They wish to give some of these things for the skins and furs which the red man does not know what to do with.